I remember all those years ago. The sun would rise, that's all I needed to know. Yesterday's clothes and I was good to go. My wooden sword against the world. And every day was like a holiday. Dusty gully where we used to play, taking apples from the branch along the way, heading down to Dalek City. Now every day I wonder, will the sun rise? Will it ripen or we've sown? Trying to see the world again.
I came to New York in 1963 as an electronics engineer and worked for the Burroughs Corporation, which is now, I think, been swallowed up by Unisys. And while there, I met another Englishman who was also working with engineering, and he told me about City College and that you could qualify to go there, that you could, that it was open, that it was free, all of which I didn't quite believe. But in any case, I went up there, and the first thing he asked me for was my high school diploma. Well, I didn't have one, and the reason I didn't have one is because I left school at 15 and then got an apprenticeship and went to school in the evening for engineering. And so I made up some story. I said, oh, I don't have it, but it's, you know, I'll get it for you eventually. So they said, all right, well, no problem, we'll let you come as a non-matric until you can come here. But then you have to pay $36 a term. So I said, all right, well, I can manage that. A lot of us were working people who were doing jobs, you know, and who'd come back to college, like myself, older students. I was already, I was 24, 25 when I came back. So I was already an older person, you know, there. And the classes were good, though. There was nothing second-rate about the evening classes. I found them to be just as exhilarating as the classes I took when I made it into the day division. The students were different. They were more exciting in some ways and less experienced in others, the way they are today when we get transfer students at Berkeley. They're amazing. You know, they've had to fight their way into a top-tier university, but they've got kids or they've got jobs, and they've had rough rides, a lot of them. And that was true back then in City. So up until then, my schooling had been pretty much a failure. I hadn't done well in school. I knew I wasn't stupid, you know, and my engineering, I passed. I didn't like engineering very much, but I forced myself to at least do the minimal amount to get through. But I was never a very good student. And so I started at City College, and I started doing very well. I got on the dean's list in the first term, and then I started getting little scholarships, and still I was a non-matric. And in the end, they wrote to me and said, look, you can matriculate. You've got the grade point average, you're doing, but we still need your high school diploma. So I said, well, I think they closed the school. So I said, but I'll write again. Anyway, they said, all right, we'll matriculate you. So they matriculated me. So I let time go on. I just forgot it. I didn't write a letter, of course. And then I got a call from the dean of students to come to their office. They had written to my high school. And the high school said, not only did Sterling not graduate from high school, but he was a disruptive influence. And we seriously question and doubt your judgment in allowing him to attend the university there. By this time, I was a straight-A student, and I was doing great. So they asked me what the real story was. So I told them the real story. And high school in the 1950s in England was pretty brutal, and it was tough. I mean, I was a grammar school boy, which means I'd passed the exams to get into the better high school. But nevertheless, it was awful. It was pretty awful. So I just, in the end, after what they meant by disruptive was that I'd led a couple of strikes in the school against what I thought were unfair practices. So I was not, they were very happy that I left in the end. But so they asked me to write up the story, which I did for them, and then they let me stay, and that was it. And I thought, only in America, another second chance. So I was very happy. And came to City College, 1965, I think, was my first time on the campus. It was an atmosphere I'd never come across before. First of all, these were students who were very bright, who came from so many different backgrounds, though not all, as we now know. And there were, for example, there were these Jewish kids who called themselves yeshiva bochas, who would be doing a rabbinical degree in the evening and a regular degree during the day. And their entire world was around ideas. And the arguments in the cafeteria and the classes would spill over into the evening, and we go from the cafeteria to a bar to a restaurant. I mean, it never seemed to stop. So I was still working as an engineer then, and I asked to be put on the midnight shift so that I could get as much out of all of this as possible and grab my sleep wherever I needed to. The courses were amazing. They were small classes. I was never in a class larger than 20, 25, because there were only a few auditoriums at City College, so that you couldn't get a large number of kids into a lot of classes, except Psych 1 and Poli-Sci 1 and all of those kinds of things. So the classes were small, full of discussion. Now I think back on it, great pedagogy. I mean, where the ideas were presented and you went at them. And I'd never been in an atmosphere like that before. It was, that was in the days when City College used to say to new freshmen coming in, look to your left, look to your right, only one of you is going to be here in 4 years. That was the atmosphere that you went into. Like, oh, you think this is hard? I'll just give you something harder. It was very competitive. And I know a lot of, from a pedagogical point of view, I know how discouraging that was for some students, but if you'd fought your way into City College by that time, you were already one of those types of people for the most part. But the expectation of me when I was at City was that because I was British and I had this accent, they assumed I'd been well educated. Everybody assumed I'd read everything. I mean, I had read one Shakespeare play when I started at City College, and I'd read that on my own. I mean, I was an appalling high school student. And so I was scrambling to keep up with these young people who had fairly decent high school education. They'd read a lot more than I had. I mean, you cannot imagine. I would go home at night, I'd listen to all of the names they wrote. I would go and get books, and I'd read and read and read until I was falling asleep. And so I was so energized by that atmosphere and that sort of celebration of ideas. I thought it was the most amazing thing, amazing place. That was the atmosphere I found, and when the inequity struggles began, I saw him as a natural partner in that. And so I joined demonstrations, usually during the height of in 68, the black students excluded the white students from those demonstrations in those days. There was a lot of discussion about where we belonged in support of their struggle, of the Hispanic and African American students. But nevertheless, we participated in those. I think we had a shutdown every spring for 3 years, pretty much. And then there was damage done. There was a fire set. And then things they really clamped down. But they also made concessions and developed the open admissions program. And that was seen as a significant victory. And then, of course, there was the anti-Vietnam War movement at the same time. So there was a lot of diverting other things going on then. The draft was on. I got my draft noticed in 67, no, 65, I got my draft notice, as did, hundreds and hundreds of other kids. So that was another movement on the campus. And SDS was active, Students for a Democratic Society. That was the atmosphere, and that's why it was so exhilarating. I felt as if I didn't sleep for 5 years. That's how amazing it was. Anyway, when open admissions began, that fall, or that summer, Mina recruited a number of the honours students in English to see whether we would be willing to do some tutoring, because she anticipated that many of the students coming in would be nowhere near up to speed for academic writing. And so we began a series of tutoring classes. And what happened was that in the end, she asked me to take on a section, even though I wasn't yet a graduate in English. Though I had, I was a senior, I was an older student. I was already 25, 26 then. No, I was close to 30, because I was finishing my degree. I started when I was 26 and then I finished at 30. And so I ended up taking a section on of these first-year remedial writing students. I have to tell you, I really didn't know what I was doing. And Mina held weekly meetings with us to go over what we could do, what would work, etc. She hadn't written a book or anything then. We were all sort of in the swim of it together. And together we devised a whole series of exercises and things like that we could do with students, how we would work with them on their writing. And that was my introduction to it. And I graduated the following year. Now, earlier, Mina had been to the Dartmouth Conference, but that's a hazy part of the world, and I don't quite remember. That was before I was teaching. But she'd gone up to a big English conference that involved a lot of people from the UK and from different parts of the US. And it was a conference on writing. And it was amazing because it had huge influence going forward. I've got a feeling that Graves from New Hampshire was there, Donald Graves, and I think a few other luminaries. I got into the Berkeley PhD program and went out there. I hated it and left and came back to Berkeley, back to New York City, and went to see Mina. And she said, "I have a job for you." And Lehman College was just starting its SEEK program. It was just getting going. And they were looking for instructors. So I took a job there. And that's how I started work at CUNY. And so it's funny, when Mina came along and started talking about these students who were coming in for the first time, whose parents had never been to college before, I did really not only empathize, but I really identified with who these young people were going to be. I knew they would be working class, essentially. I knew they would come from backgrounds where there weren't any books in the house, as there's been in my own case. And so I was very keen to see if I could find boys and girls like myself who I thought could make it. And so I was really quite passionate about the idea. And when SEEK came along and the Open Admissions program came along, and I started working with these young people, I got very excited about it. I thought, this is the career for me. This is what I would like to do. I'd like to teach young people like this. Ken Bruffee, I doubt he's changed. I've seen him over the years. He's wonderful. He's one of the most generous people. He would always have time for you, no matter how busy he is. He would always have you come over to the house. He would always go out and have a meal with you. He was very generous with his time, and he was very generous in the sort of the group of CUNY people who were struggling with writing, and all of us who would sit around tables and talk. He was always willing to give time to that. He's one of my favorite people in the business. He's quite amazing. It sort of builds on what Mina also talked about, and that is that understanding why students do the things they do. That was the first principle. Mina always pushed that a lot, that when students make mistakes, it's not by accident. There's a reason that they're doing what they do. So that was the first thing. The other thing was in actually helping students be reflective about their own learning. I thought that was one of the most powerful lessons that Bruffee talked about. And of course, Sandra took that work up too very well. But Bruffee always made a point of sort of developing meta skills, so that you're never just doing something because this is the practice, but you're always looking at it too and seeing why I'm doing what I'm doing and what are the results of what I do. So it's making you a conscious learner while you're trying to teach others to be conscious learners too. And I think that's one of the most powerful things. It's also respect, huge respect for students. Not false, not superficial, a genuine respect for what students know and think and believe. And so that was, I think, they're the biggest lessons I learned from him. So you may know that in the early 70s, there was a recession in the country. There was a lot of unemployment. And one of the bills passed in Congress, actually it was a Lyndon Johnson idea, was called CETA, the Comprehensive Employment and Training Act. And what they did is supplied money to hire young professionals, not very much money, I might add. And during that time, you had to put together different projects that would help in the Civil Rights Act implementation. And that included first-generation college students who were coming in. And so Lehman asked me to put together a learning center, a writing center. I got to know Bruffee's work, especially around peer tutoring and how that worked. And so I got very involved in putting together a center based on the peer tutoring work. It also, we supplemented it with grammar materials and things like that. But it was, I would say, partially successful. Some of the work I thought was really good, but I didn't then understand what kind of training you had to give tutors in order for them to be effective. It wasn't a question of saying, well, you know how to write, so help them with their writing. It was more complicated than that. You had to actually understand, you had to understand yourself as a writer and how you actually construct writing. And that kind of meta-awareness was pretty rare back then. People wrote or they didn't write. They didn't really think much about it. And so we had to develop strategies of training for tutors that was actually more complex and more effective. It was some time before I understood the full complexity of what I was trying to do. Bruffee's work is more sophisticated than it looks on first blush. And for myself, I don't think I fully understood then what it meant to help students take the knowledge they were acquiring and put it in the shape of the demand of an assignment, to put it in the shape of some cogent thinking that the course demanded that they display. And so when I got perfunctory writing, I thought, well, maybe my question is wrong, or maybe the material is not understood. And I think now, when I think back on it, I think it's much more that I didn't really understand how to formulate good questions. I didn't understand how to raise questions that peeled back the content of the material that they were learning, so that a lot of the questions would be superficial, and then the results would be superficial from the writing of the students. In other words, you got what you gave, rather than developing a more sophisticated way of unpacking material, so that what the students then wrote would come out of a more cogent understanding of the material. So Mina organised a group of people that she drew from across CUNY. She was at this point, I think, at 80th Street, and it was something called the Instructional Resource Centre. And she was in charge of that at 80th Street. She was beautiful. She was as smart as hell. She came out of some cornfields in Kansas or some unlikely place like that. And she was a great spirit. And you met her and you just wanted to do what she asked you to do. She had a real charismatic personality, and we miss her still. She had a belief in students and a belief in learning that was across every domain. Nobody was left out in the world that she understood the university should be about. She was so curious about so many different things, what students knew and understood, and from worlds that she knew nothing about. And she got a group of us together, and it consisted of John Brereton at Queensborough, McQuaid and Lyons and Marie Ponceau at Queen's, Harvey Weiner at LaGuardia, Brereton, Sandra Pola Ostos, myself at Lehman, there were about 2 or 3 others, and she would bring us to the Instructional Resource Centre and basically exploit us, to get us to do work. And one of the things about Mina is you couldn't really say no to her. She had a way of putting things, even though it was all in addition to our work, but all of us were scurrying around doing what she told us to do. And there was something magical about her doing that. Okay, so when CAUSE was founded, the CUNY Association of Writing Supervisors, it was a breath of fresh air for me, because here was a group of people who had all been doing similar things to, what I had been up to at Lehman, but it was like a hotbed of ideas around writing and the teaching of writing. It was. I would never miss a meeting, even though it was on some dismal Wednesday evening at the old Graduate Center on 42nd Street. And it was just, but we always got there, and we went out and we would have a meal sometimes, and we'd hang out together and make plans and be ambitious. And one of the things we did that was really super was that we had an annual conference. And even back then I had a reputation of being good at sort of money issues and sort of building money and finding money. So they put me in charge. I think I was the treasurer for some time. And I built up a nice pot of money. I mean, it was, back then it was in 4 figures, so it was pretty substantial. And then we mounted the conference at Roosevelt House for many years, or at least it felt like many years. I think it must be at least 4 or 5 years. And the conference had amazing sessions. I mean, really, it mined the richness of writing programs across CUNY. And if you look back at the agenda and the program for those times, you can see the range. But my memory is it was one of the best conferences for teaching writing in the city. And we did that every spring for several years. It was completely exhilarating. It was, those were the golden times. The discussions were about pedagogy. They were about research. They were about how do we know what we're doing is making a difference. We're all humanities people by and large, so we didn't have the kind of research head that somebody in the social sciences might have, though we came to recognize that as we went on. And what were your students like? Are they different from my students? Are Lehman students different from the Bronx, from Brooklyn or Queens? What were the demographics? Did that make a difference to the kind of offerings? What was your success rate like? What was your dropout rate? We had all this comparison going on that would help you sort of say, well, if you're managing to do this, how did you do that? So we exchanged a lot of information, and I think it improved all our programs. There were good ideas from all over. And it was very comradely. And I started going to 4Cs because of CAUSE. I started going to the 4Cs conference, and I think I was invited to do a session or two with Don McQuaid and Brereton and people like that. So it was a real professional group, a professional unit. Though we had a lot of laughs too. So it was really quite wonderful. Then Mina, by that time, was already expanding her work and helping other branches of CUNY do its work. And one of the things they asked her to do was to put together a kind of survey of writing programs across CUNY. And she asked me, John Brereton and Sandra Pearl to do that work, among others. My colleague Don McQuaid also, I think, was involved in it. He was at Queen's then. And so off we went to do this survey, and that's how I met John and Sandra. And John was at Queensborough Community College, and Sandra was at Ostos Community College. And we did the survey together. Well, it was Mina's request that we find out what was going on, and then to see to what extent they were successful in each of these campuses. How many students were coming out of remediation and succeeding in the college. So she wanted to know, well, exactly how do these writing programs run? And we found huge variation. Ultimately, I think CUNY moved towards a more standardized system and and the CUNY Association of Writing Supervisors, I think, was influential in pulling together what became the standard tests in this area. But initially, I think Mina simply wanted to know, well, what is campuses doing? It was a free-for-all. Everybody made up their own mind how to go about doing these things. And so we thought, well, there must be some better than others. And Mina wanted to know what the best practices were. And about halfway through that project, Mina said she'd like us to apply for a grant, the three of us, to study more formally what was happening with these freshman students as they progressed through the remedial programs in writing. So we put together a proposal, and we got funded from a group at Washington called the Fund for the Improvement of Post-Secondary Education. And then we really started working together. So then we were working on this, what was called the Writing Development Project. And John, Sandra, and I worked on that for a couple of years. And John was already getting, I think, a little restless at Queensborough. And he applied and got a job at Wayne State in Detroit. And Sandra got a job at Lehman with me. So she came to Lehman. And I continued at Lehman. I was still in the SEEK program. She came, I think, into the English department, I remember. Anyway, while we were there together, before John left, we then applied for another grant to start a writing project from Berkeley. They were expanding the national writing, it wasn't called the National Writing Project. We're extending the writing project. Anyway, we got the grant. It was a massive $20,000. And with that, we brought in the first cohort that then became the New York City Writing Project. And Sandra, John, and I founded it, directed it for some time on. Because John went on to Wayne State, and so we lost him. And then Sandra and I did it for a couple of years, few years after that. And then the project just took off in ways that none of us could have anticipated. I mean, it was amazing. It grew so fast. And there we were in the midst of a highly successful project. We brought in 2 high school teachers to co-run the writing project, name of Marcy Wolf and Carla Asher. Marcy Wolf is there still at Lehman College, now running an organization I then formed afterwards called the Institute for Literacy Studies at Lehman. And that was when, and then Sandra started doing more research work. She started teaching at the Graduate Center, a number of other things. She sort of backed away from and did more writing across the curriculum work and other things. And I then sort of took on the writing project with Carla and Marcy, and we developed it from there. John, Sandra and I were presenting at 4Cs in 1977, spring. It was in San Francisco. And at the end of our session, it was on writing development. It was the Tipsy grant that we got. And so we had some initial results that we presented there. And afterwards, these three people came up to us. And Jim Gray was a character, small, round fellow. And he'd come up, and he was very sort of gruff. And he said, interesting work. He said, how would you like to start a writing project? So I looked at John and Sandra, and we looked at each other, and he said, well, what is it? He said, it's easy. He said, we give you a little money. He said, and then you bring a bunch of teachers together, and they talk about writing, and they write. That's it. So I looked at John and Sandra, and we thought, this is the flakiest California idea I've ever heard of. This is like typical. We were in San Francisco, and there's a bunch of people tell you, just get teachers together, and they just do. And I thought to myself, this is never going to work in New York. So, but anyhow, there was $20,000 attached to it, including a nice little stipend for John, Sandra, and me, and a stipend for all the teachers. So I thought, well, all right, we'll have a go. I mean, remembering I had not been inside a high school or any other kind of school, K-12, since I was in one. So I didn't know anything about school teaching. But I did have a question that was embedded in this, and that is, why are these bright young working class kids coming to college without writing skills? What's going on? And the natural thing is to say, well, maybe it's high school. Maybe we should be looking at high schools. And so, when you're in an English department or a writing department, you're not up to do research in public schools. That's education usually. That's where they do those things. But anyhow, we decided to do the project, and we advertised. I can't even remember how we advertised, but we got about 50 teachers who applied, and out of those we selected 25, as we were told to do. And we were told to do three things. That teachers should be included in the institute if they could demonstrate a successful practice in the teaching of writing. 2, they had to be willing to write themselves, because the principle is that if you're going to teach writing, you should write yourself. And the third thing was to be willing to think about developing workshops for other teachers. That was the model. There were the 3 parts: writing, demonstrating teaching of writing, and then be willing to take it further when you got back the following year. So again, it sounded pretty flaky to us. There didn't seem to be any content except what the teachers brought. But of course, that was the genius of it, because we did select 25 amazing teachers. They knew so much more about teaching than we did. And Jim Gray's vision was simply get the best teachers of writing you can find, have them talk to each other, have them demonstrate good practice, and then form a network out of it. And that's what we did. That first summer in 1977 or 78, I think it was 77, no, 78. And it was stunning. Jim Gray came out to visit us that first year. Right, so the process that we brought to it was understanding that writing is a recursive process, understanding that that writing is on a spectrum or on a continuum from private notes to public discourse, and that writing has many, many purposes in between and among all of those things. That reflection and developing a meta-awareness of your writing process is a very powerful way to improve your writing. It's a very powerful way to understand your own thinking. that learning, that writing is different for different people. That not everyone has exactly the same process. Some people like to do an outline, some people like to free write, some people, in other words, that there were multiple ways in. So all of those are the kinds of things that we brought to it. That a piece of writing it must have an audience and a purpose, and that it is more joyful when you formulate your own approach to writing that is more conducive to your style and your approach to writing, and that helping you find the best way that you can be a writer is part of what we try to do in the summer. So we give lots of different kinds of writing. One thing we would do at the beginning is to ask them to write about themselves as writers, or to describe a powerful learning experience. And we got them to think a lot about what made it powerful, so that they became examiners of their own learning, not just as a writer, but as a learner. And then we would ask them to compare that approach to the way they teach writing and the way they teach English, so that they would have a basis of making a comparison between themselves as learners and the students that they teach during the year. They're the kinds of conversations and exercises that we would do in the class. In addition, there would be 2 or 3 substantive pieces that they would choose of their own choosing. It could be about education, or it needn't be about education. We didn't stipulate. But after the initial piece of writing we had them do, we would also have them do a piece at the end, often in the form of a letter, which is another form of writing, of course. So it was rich in that everybody brought this kind of thing, but we would also always ask the participants what they could bring to this too. What did they think was the most successful ways of teaching writing? And then we asked them why. People usually don't ask that question. So why is it successful? What's your theory of action here? What kinds of things did you imagine you were going to get as a result? We also encourage them to bring student writing to the Summer Institute of their own students, so they could sort of have a solid piece that said, look, here's what students were doing, say, at this time, with this assignment, here's what they did here. We also asked them about assignments that failed and whether they could interrogate that. But the group would do that. This is why I think this didn't work. Oh, this is why it did work. So I would say that they read Murray, they read Graves, they read Emig, though they weren't too keen on research readings. But what we often found, and the most important of all, Jem Moffat, teaching the Universal Discourse. That was probably one of the beginning texts, and very important for all of us. Teachers generally thought it was terrible, though the curriculum book that we also bought for them, the K-12 book, which is a wonderful book, many of them came back years later and said it was the most powerful resource they ever had as teachers. It was just brilliant work. So Jim Moffat's work was really, really important. And then the last piece I forgot, also forgetting all these other influences, this is an example of the recursive process working, was the British work. Jimmy Britton, Nancy Martin, Peter Medway, development of writing abilities across the curriculum. All that work was also part of what we would do. We would talk about the difference between transactional writing and what Jimmy Britton called poetic writing, which we would call more creative writing. And so there was a lot of influences. We would give them a lot of materials to read. I don't think all of them worked very well. I think we tended to overwhelm them with material initially. But there were a few things that I think stuck. And Graves' work, particularly, and Murray's work, I think, was something that everybody liked. They liked the results of the research, but they weren't too keen on reading it. Then, of course, you have to get money for the next year. And it continued and continued. And the New York City Writing Project became the largest writing project in the country. Now, of course, it's the largest school district too, so that follows on. But we were particularly successful in getting direct funding from the Board of Education in New York. And one of the reasons we were very successful is because we brought in these 2 teachers to run the project with us. And it was bringing them in that really turned the corner on the project. They also applied for funding. We got more funding from FIPSI to develop this model. That meant we could offer stipends to teachers to become part of the network. And it got our foot in the door offering workshops in schools. And what the next phase was, I thought, well, how do you protect a project? A project comes and goes in any university. And so I wanted an umbrella structure that would protect the project. So I thought, well, we'd have an institute. I didn't really know what it was. It's a term of art in CUNY, as it is in all universities. They're like organized research units of some kind. So the university, Lehman supported me in developing something called the Institute for Literacy Studies. And I put the writing project under that. And at that point, I actually started a New York City math project based exactly on the same lines, which I got a grant from NSF, from the National Science Foundation, to do that. And that's still flourishing as far as I know. And when I left to go to California to head up the National Writing Project, Marcy Wolf, the original high school teacher who came into the project, took over the Institute for Literacy Studies, and she's currently there. I think what happened with the, I'm trying to remember what happened with the CUNY, the WAT test originally. It was an accountability move. One of the things that we were discovering is how expensive remediation is to the university. And there was a pushback on the funding. And there was also talk about the dropout rate being so incredibly high. And SEEK programs in particular were examined. I think there was a lot more scrutiny of those programs than there was of other things. And so they said, well, there's no accountability in these programs, you know, and so we need a test. I remember it coming about, and I remember, in fact, we had to implement the test. I don't know anybody that thought it was a genuine reflection of the learning of students, but it was a skill they could learn for the most part and get through. I don't think it was just a time waster and annoying. I never felt that we had a choice, because the status of the SEEK programs was not very high, and there was a lot of talk in the university, in the different colleges, that, you know, who are these students and are they really college material? All of that kind of discussion that was going on all the time. And we were, in a certain sense, pressured to show that these students could make it. And this test came up, and I thought to myself, I must say, when I saw it, I didn't think it had much value, but I didn't think it wasn't doable. If this was the price we had to pay to keep our funding and to keep moving, I thought that it would be something you would do, but then you would teach. Then it would be separate. It would be like something you'd have to devote, you know, maybe a week of preparation for. The idea that you would devote or steer your course along the lines of CUNY WAT test was appalling, and I never would do that. And most of the instructors I know didn't do it either. But no doubt there were people who felt this was the way the course should be done now, all around this time 20-minute test. You know, the same testing dilemma is happening in high schools, and it's happened everywhere. And the best teachers that we worked with in New York City, who were also subject to this rigorous testing business and in another realm, just found ways to still teach. But a lot didn't. A lot became test prep courses. And I think that was an error. I don't think it should have been. I don't think it was necessary to. But that, a lot of people might disagree with me, because it did have a dampening atmosphere on the whole process. But I regarded it as a bureaucratic thing to get around and to fulfill it in a perfunctory way. but not to steer my course, or not to have my course embedded in the preparation of the what, which was not very good, put it mildly.
And every day I wonder where we're headed, and every day another load, another junction in the wrong direction, down on Liberty Road.